much to both of you, and we're
Thank
going
you.
to talk about international pharmacy trends, but I want to start by talking to you, Daragh, about post-COVID burnout, which I think is something that you're particularly exercised by. How significant an issue is it?
Do you know, we are here to talk about the future of pharmacy, Matt, but I think we can't have this conversation about burnout and post-COVID burnout in particular without looking in the broader context of the society that we work in. So many of the things that the excellent contributors made commentary around this morning was, as a society, how do we function and how do we wish now to conduct ourselves? So what I know from my international experience is that throughout the world, people are feeling burnout in their profession and our profession, which is pharmacy. But also then you turn on the news, and in Britain 100,000 nurses are going on strike for the first time that nurses have ever voted to go on strike. You can see that people are choosing what is important to them in their life and also in their lifestyle. And I think there's been a big acceleration from that because of how we had to change how we lived. To bring it back to the particular, because we are here to talk about pharmacy, I think we are probably no different from engineers, from accountants, from architects, from solicitors, from lots of other professions that are out there that we're feeling it. And I would fear that the repercussion for that is going to be around the quality of the service that we can deliver to the people that we serve. I don't want that to suffer because the burnout and the regulatory burden that is being put on us, the mind the market forces that are being put on us, if that isn't recognised, because the solutions and the cures are out there.
Caoimhe, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I agree with what Daragh has said, and I suppose when you think about, if I reflect on pharmacy in particular, we've heard anecdotally from people who have spoken already about the 70, the 60-hour shifts or the 60-hour weeks. There's that element of it where we already have people in practice who have gone through what has been an incredibly difficult couple of years, who absolutely are feeling the burnout. And then we have the younger generation who are starting to go through their pharmacy programmes. They've seen what's happened with their peers in the last couple of years. They've also seen a pharmacy environment that probably feels a little bit different than what they would have been expecting. So I agree exactly with what Daragh said.
So it feels different in what way?
So I think, if I reflect on even when I qualified, so I'm qualified a couple of decades now. I suppose my perception of when I qualified would have been that I would have been involved in a lot more clinical practice, so that my skill set as a pharmacist would have been utilised to allow me to do other services that have been talked about earlier beyond the traditional dispensing services. And when I qualified actually in the UK, and if I even look at our UK neighbours and then we look globally, the utilisation of the pharmacist has massively excelled. And I think for us, we unfortunately seem to be caught in this limbo where we haven't moved as fast as our neighbours. But I also think that's a massive opportunity, because I think, as somebody alluded to, we've seen actually how pharmacies stepped up to the plate during COVID, but it's now really ramping up on what happened there and moving it on.
So does that mean for pharmacists that it could be a lot of extra work, or could it be a lot more satisfying work?
So I believe it could be a lot more satisfying work. I think if I reflect on the degree course that our pharmacists do and the master's courses, we are very well equipped to be actually able to use our skill set much more broader than we currently are. And actually we have the privilege, as I know some of my other peers here do, of taking on undergraduate pharmacists. And actually when they come into community pharmacy, that's what they talk about. They talk about all the other things that they are equipped to do in university, all the other skills that they have, and that is absolutely where they want to utilise their skill set into the future.
So what is the future, do you think, for pharmacists in Ireland? Will they be given by the state the authority to go and do more things?
I think ultimately, Matt, we need to decide that as a society, and I think it's actually not going, if pharmacists can help the argument be made, but ultimately the people we serve have never appreciated more the service that we offer them. So you'll be familiar with the Ipsos poll that gave us a 97% trust rating. Like, even internationally, colleagues will come to me and say that's off the charts. Like, that really is fantastic. So the most important thing now, generations back and generations forward, is always going to be that personal relationship that we have with the people that we serve. From a policy perspective, and nobody's used the word sláinte care. We do remember that there was such a thing as sláinte care. It was recognised that we need to move the services that people need closer to the services. So it wasn't as if by magic that we were able to administer 1.2 million COVID vaccination doses. It was actually that was 1.1 or 1.2 million choices that Irish people made because they had, according to the government, the choice to go and have that at the GP or have it in a vaccination centre. So if you see any international comparator, we were able to get up to 92, 94% vaccination, which is, bear in mind, 95 is as much as you could have for COVID vaccinations, because people had the opportunity to have choice and access to that service through their community pharmacy. Now, I wouldn't be unique, Matt, in being here as a pharmacist. There was probably 1.1 million conversations with people saying, why can't I get more services like this here in my pharmacy? So I know that people are advocating for that, and the Irish Pharmacy Union certainly are advocating for that. But I think we need just to keep pushing that along. And I am really heartened to see new services like being able to do more for young women who want to access contraceptive services and are finding it difficult to get that link into general practice, which probably isn't the most appropriate place for that conversation to happen most of the time for that age cohort.
But can pharmacists take on the extra workload? Because we've heard, for example, GPs are saying they get all the extra medical cards for children they can't see their patients. The suggestion has been, well then, move certain types of work off to the pharmacist. But do the pharmacists have the capacity to deal with the extra work?
Yeah, so I think it was Sharon talked about looking at lean processing within our own pharmacies and within our own dispensaries. And I think that's something that we probably are going to have to hold a torch up to ourselves and really think about how we move on. I know Una will talk about digitisation, but certainly pharmacy optimisation and automation, and really thinking about how we deal with some of the processes that we currently have to free up our time to actually be able to deliver those additional services is the way forward. And I think very similar to the way Sharon spoke about, kind of going ahead of the market and having those 3 consultation rooms in place in preparation for being able to deliver services. That's almost the outside look in that we need to take to our own dispensaries as well, because if that is where we want the future to go and we see the future to be, then there is a piece of work for all of us to undertake around getting ourselves ready to be able to deliver that work.
Are there any international comparisons though where this works well, Daragh?
Well, the first international comparison to see this working well is how successful COVID vaccination in community pharmacy was. Because we now present internationally and say this is really something important, because we were one of only 16 countries where pharmacists were vaccinating against flu. Because of COVID, now that's come up to 40, but that still means there's probably 120 jurisdictions out there that aren't. So it's not to say that we're not advancing, because we are, but the opportunity to do more exists. The reason why COVID vaccination was such a success through community pharmacy was it was resourced properly. There are examples of where the legislative power was given to pharmacists to do the service in other countries, such as Italy, but because the fee was so low, it just financially didn't make sense to do it. So like any system, and a lot of what we're talking about here is a socialist system, which is free at the point of access or nearly free, and they want to then take the best of capitalism, which is us fighting each other in a competitive way to deliver the best value. What we need to be able to do is say, if we resource anything that you want us to do, if you resource it, we'll be able to do it. And if you need proof, you just look at the success of the rollout of COVID vaccination and flu vaccines through community pharmacy.
But the point is, are there other countries, apart from the COVID vaccinations and the flu vaccinations, that have offered greater services to their customers than pharmacists can do in Ireland?
There's a really good example now of a new contract that is underway between pharmacists and the provincial or the state government in New South Wales in Australia. So very simply, pharmacists have four core functions. So number 1 is to dispense medicines. Number 2 is to administer medicines. Number 3 is to prescribe medicines. And number 4 is to review medicines. Currently now, we get paid to dispense medicines, and that's the volume thing that we're talking about. And we get paid to administer medicines. We kind of get paid to prescribe medicine. So if you come to my community pharmacy and say you're suffering from seasonal rhinitis, and we come up with a medicine that's going to be the one most suitable for you, I charge you for it and you go on your way. So I've just prescribed a medicine for you and I get paid for it. The last one then is when we review medicines. So when somebody comes in with a new prescription and it's very complicated and we spend time, say particularly if somebody is making the transition from secondary care to primary care, step down back to their home with a hospital prescription. If we spend 20 minutes or a half an hour making sure that that's clinically appropriate for that patient, we still get paid the same amount of money as we do for somebody that's a lot simpler but has the same volume. So what they've done now in New South Wales is they've recognised that they want to take pharmacists' expertise and to back it in that review process before that goes back into the community. And by recognising the 4 core functions, we then have an opportunity to say we can do all of these things. But the resource must follow the skill, or the skill cannot get utilised.
But do pharmacists want to do all that from a legal or liability point of view as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think don't forget what they currently do in terms of the handling, dispensing and giving advice on medicines. It's probably way above and beyond in terms of any ramifications of getting that wrong. So I think that's probably the point to hold and not to miss, because sometimes I think it can almost be seen as a bit transactional, whereas in reality we know the dispensing of the medicine is obviously the transaction that happens, but actually it's the trust that's built between the patient and the pharmacist, and a lot of the medical advice that's given at that point that actually is probably what the bulk of the conversation is. And that's very, very different than what we would see, certainly even in our counterparts in the UK. It possibly is slightly more transactional, whereas that trust and that relationship, as was alluded to earlier, with Irish pharmacists is massive, and that is very, very different here. And I think that's a point not to lose as well, that certainly when we progress with the expansion of other core services, that still fundamentally remains really important. I mean, we spent, what was it, 2.3 billion last year on medicines, and pharmacists are the experts in medicines. So absolutely, that is a core function of what they'll do.
Do you think are customers of pharmacists going to have the same trust in a pharmacist as they would as a patient with a doctor?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably 2 reasons really give me hope to believe that. So I think number 1, you only need to see the reaction of patients during COVID. So not just in terms of vaccinations, but actually, if we're being really honest, 90% of the time, we're probably the most and only accessible healthcare professional in a bricks and mortar space. And our patients would have come to us, and actually their asks and their expectations of us would have been even more than they would have been previously in that time of COVID. So that absolutely gives me reason to believe. And then second, I think the way our system currently is, unfortunately, we do have a more private financial involvement in how we pay for healthcare, which often actually means that patients will come to us as the first port of call before they will even access their own GPs or their own doctors.
Daragh, to that point?
I think it is a different relationship, because what you find is even the way we describe the people we serve, sometimes we call them patients and sometimes we call them customers. But like, if you're having a conversation with the pharmacist about, say, seasonal rhinitis, Matt, you don't consider yourself to be a patient. You think of a patient as somebody who's got a drip in their arm and they're on a trolley in a hospital. So I think what we need to do is look back at that core functionality, that we can't lose the real resource that we have, which is the network, the bricks and mortar of community pharmacy, that people want that human interaction, and that's where they get it. It doesn't have to be a human interaction all the time, because I can WhatsApp with patients, I can FaceTime with patients, I can talk to them on the phone, but I want to be able to give them the choice and the access that they want, and that's going to be the future of it. We changed our work practices during COVID because we had to cut down on the amount of face-to-face interactions. But I think probably on the whole, the amount of actual interactions probably went up. And we all then kind of started to decide, actually, this is not a bad way of working, because the disruption helped us to move on.
Keith, I'm going to give you one other example, which has come up regularly on my radio show, The Last Word, women and contraception. And very much often feeling it's a real swizz to have to go to a doctor for a full appointment, 60 or 80 quid, depending on what part of the country they're in, mainly just to get their blood pressure taken. Yeah. That's something that easily can be done by pharmacists, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. So I think first it would probably be remiss of me not to acknowledge the fact that we now have the contraception scheme, which means that we do have more ease of financial access to those in the 16 to 25 and soon to be up to 30 cohort to actually access their medication. But for me, I think the bit that's fundamentally missing is actually, as you have just described, so I'm a woman, I'm busy, I have things going on in my life. Exactly to your point, I know my pharmacist and I know me myself, I'm capable of doing what is required in order to receive that contraception. So actually, whilst it has been massively beneficial to introduce that scheme, still having to bypass and go to a doctor for the issuing of a prescription, for me is probably where there is a massive opportunity for community pharmacy to step into that space. In my opinion, there is no reason that you couldn't go to your community pharmacy when appropriate for your contraception. In some of those instances, it doesn't have to be through your GP.
Labour issues, let's talk about those as well. I mean, how significant is there an undersupply of pharmacists coming into the profession?
You know, Sharon spoke really, really well about this earlier, and I think she really nailed it. I think that I qualified as a pharmacist, Matt, in 1997, and I'm number 6,122 on the register. There are now, it's up at number 13,500. So that means out there, typically, there's about 7,000 pharmacists. So it isn't that there aren't pharmacists, there are.
The population is growing quite
The population,
as well.
it has. But the point I'd make is that I think that we are not giving people the opportunity to be the best pharmacists that they can be when they come to work in a community pharmacy. And that's not any one particular person's fault or one particular entity's fault. I think there's lots of moving parts with it. And I really would echo again what Sharon was saying is that if we can create that environment where the pharmacists can be the best pharmacists that they can be, but also not to take, you know what I mean, I'm an old guy with grey hair now, give out about young people nowadays. I'm not going to do that, because what we need to do is we need to recognise that the world moves on and the way people want to work their lives and maybe not do a 40-hour week, but it might suit more to do a 20-hour week. I see a collegiate way of working where you would have maybe 2 or 3 pharmacists working in a single pharmacy to allow them to have those opportunities for that lifestyle blend in with the very supportive professional environment.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you know, when we talk to our own young pharmacists and any of our pharmacists actually, it is that combination of, you know, what's important to me and certainly that happiness in your workplace is massively important.
Yeah, but what about what's important to the patient who might want to go into their local community pharmacy and have a trusted relationship, and instead they find that it's one person one week and another person the following week?
Yeah, and certainly that does create a challenge. But I think for us, and certainly, you know, I can speak to ourselves, if we can look internally about the environments that we create, we're hopeful that that will actually create less of a shift. And I think the other thing is, you know, our ability to have a locum population is really, really important. Because actually none of us want to be in that position where we're working 60, 70 hours a week, which is not safe and it's not sustainable. And actually what we need to do as well is bring our locum population along with us too and say, well, how does it feel to work in here? Would you like to do more shifts in here as well? So I think to the point that was made earlier, you know, it's not about just looking at it and kind of complaining about it. It's actually probably reflecting on, well, actually, I absolutely know that consistency and continuity of care is incredibly important to my patients. So how do I create the environment where I can create as much consistency as possible?
What about relationships with GPs in this situation?
Yeah, I kind of have a little rule of thumb, Matt. I get to talk a little bit about pharmacy at pharmacy conferences, that I don't really come to pharmacy conferences to talk about general practitioners. You know what I mean? I don't sit in on their consultations and tell them how to do their job, and I'm not really interested in what they have to tell me.
So I asked you about relationships and you basically said you don't have one.
So that's my roundabout answer. If you catch my drift. So we are part of a healthcare continuum, and a really important person in the healthcare continuum is a pharmacist, but it's also a physiotherapist, it's also a dentist, it could be any number of people, occupational therapists, and a GP is really important in that as well. The closest working relationship that we have as pharmacists with other people within that healthcare continuum are GPs. But I think within the healthcare continuum, if we don't start to have a healthcare system that recognises the most important person in the healthcare continuum is the person who needs the healthcare. It's not the healthcare provider. And what I would worry about is anybody within that healthcare continuum who is a provider trying to do something at the exclusion of patient choice and patient access. Because ultimately, I don't particularly see myself as an advocate for pharmacists. I see myself as an advocate for people accessing good quality healthcare in a way that suits them and their lifestyle at a very early point of an intervention, rather than waiting for it to go downstream when they are that person hooked up to an IV line on a trolley in an overcrowded hospital.
To that point?
Yeah, I think if it always starts, if your principal is the patient, I do think as well there is more opportunity, certainly within our current health systems, for collaboration. And I think there are brilliant examples, again, both in our closest neighbours and further afield, where we have seen that collaboration make massive difference to patient outcomes. So I know Daragh has referenced some of the things around minor ailments, but if you even take that right back to what it is, so if you think about being able to help not just those who have a chronic condition who are unwell at that stage, but those who are coming in from what we would describe as quite a minor treatment, if we can help with that intervention at that stage and actually then fundamentally maybe move that on to treatment, that's a massive opportunity for patient care. And if I think about how that's demonstrated, even within Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, that's already present there and making a massive difference. And anything that then builds on from that and that collaboration ultimately is benefiting the patient.
While you're on a roll about the doctors, how do you feel about the wholesalers?
We're in the room.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, Paul, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Quite honestly, I think there was a 60 seconds or a 90 second slot there where I actually believed them and what they were saying. No, on a very, very serious level, I have Dermot and I have Paul on speed dial, because it's really, really important for the relationship that I have as the chairman of CommCare, which is an amalgamation of 120 pharmacies. We are the largest group of entity of dispensing medicines in the country. So a really, really important relationship, one of the most important relationships that we can have as an entity who've come together to make life easier for pharmacists to do and be all the things that we aspire to be, is to have a really good working relationship with the wholesalers. And the absolute nth degree to which they went to get medicines to community pharmacies during COVID really deserves a round of applause. And I know that doesn't put money or increase your 1% margin or whatever it might be, but they were absolutely fantastic. And Paul and Dermot need an awful lot of credit, more than they'll probably ever get, for everything that they did during COVID and the difference it made to us that we could keep our doors open.
Aren't you lucky you're not doctors? How about for you? I mean, your relationship with Boots with the wholesalers as well, how is that?
Yeah, it's your most, beyond your patient, it's one of your most important relationships, because, we're hearing about the challenges, we know the challenges on the ground, but actually having that pipeline of support where possible, it's so important, because again, in everything that was spoken about this morning between the two wholesalers, the person who ultimately loses out when this all goes wrong is the patient. So having that, continuum of care and knowing that actually, whilst it may be frustrating for us on the ground, perhaps if, we are one of the ones who may be receiving the more rationed items, or we just have something that's out of stock, having the trust actually in the two wholesalers to be able to have that conversation with your patient that we will get this to you as soon as we possibly can is massively important.
Paul and Dermot spoke about their frustration about not knowing who to go to in the Department of Health for very serious issues to be discussed. I believe you want a chief pharmacy officer. Tell us why and what that role would entail.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is something that is fundamentally important both to our future strategic direction and to the future, I suppose, oversight of the profession. So we are a bit of an outlier in terms of being one of the countries who actually doesn't have that role in place, even within our closest neighbours. But I think having that role in place, it creates a very unique position within the department in that the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, in the same way as the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Dental Officer, the Chief Nursing Officer, it's about oversight of the entire profession, and it's about understanding actually what is the strategic direction for that profession and how can they agitate to move that profession in the right way. I feel a little bit at the moment, we're sometimes stumbling a bit in the blind, as was described by yourselves, around trying to understand who's the right person around the table that we need to have the right conversation with. And certainly within the Department of Health, having somebody in that position creates that opportunity to really, really stand, I suppose, tall and firm on the opportunities for pharmacy and what pharmacy can bring to the healthcare system.
Can't imagine you disagree with that, do you?
I wholeheartedly agree with this. If I could just kind of, you started our conversation, Matt, talking about burnout, and so much of what we want to be able to do is to allow pharmacists be the best pharmacists that they can be. When Paul talks about his ability to stock the medicines that we need in his warehouse and get them to us, he's having those shortages. We're actually probably not as badly off in Ireland. I think there's a downstream coming of medicine shortages. So one of the studies looking at burnout that was done by the IPU in 2018, and we presented it internationally, and nobody actually had done that, asking pharmacists what it was like to be a pharmacist and what can we do to make it better. That study has been copied a couple of times around the world, but time and motion studies then that have come from those are saying that pharmacists can spend up to 20% of their time, of their working day, trying to source medicines that are out of stock. Now, if I was to say to you, how can you work more cleverly, or what would a chief pharmaceutical officer say around the table where problem solving is hopefully happening within the HSE, the argument that you would make is if you give prescriptive or substitutive power, because of the clinical knowledge that a community pharmacist has, you can substitute one drug for another when it's safe to do so. So we were given the opportunity to do that, I think about 3 years ago when there was a shortage of a medicine, if I remember correctly, candesartan, or we could change valsartan to candesartan, which is all very technical, but at the upper level of how you're thinking at policy level, if you had a chief pharmaceutical officer, and I'll go back to my point, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. If you had a chief pharmaceutical officer sat at the table, they can be a problem solver for that problem. Now, currently, how we work is Caoimhe or I have to pick up the phone and ring the person who prescribed the medicine, who doesn't have a clue whether it's available or not, to ask them to prescribe something else. And you know what they say, Matt? What would you recommend yourself, Daragh? Mm-hmm. I'll email you the prescription. And that's a half an hour of my day wasted. And you know who else's time it's wasting? It's wasting the patient's time, but it's also wasting the GP's time. And I do have some empathy for them sometimes.
Do we have any questions or comments from the audience, please? We have a microphone going here at the very front from Una before she comes for her own session. Up at the very front here, please, Amy.
Eva, you obviously have lots of experience with your other colleagues across the Boots network in the UK and the North. What services can you see that they're rolling out that you feel would be like absolute no-brainer, low-hanging fruit that we could do for our patients here now?
Yeah, so I think for me there's probably two arms to it. So one is keep doing more of what we're currently doing and has been recognised as something that pharmacy is well placed to do, so more in the vaccination space. I think the other big opportunity is around that minor ailments piece. So starting with, I suppose, what's sometimes deemed as quite basic in terms of, Daragh described how actually you are prescribing anyway, actually how we would complete minor ailments and then move that into more complex services. So if I take Wales, for example, so Wales are offering minor ailment services walk-in, so not just through referral from NHS or 111. But if you walk in, you can have your medication effectively prescribed for you by your pharmacist and then covered by the state. They have then evolved on from that around test and treat. So they've then said, actually, okay, there are some ailments where we'd probably need to test for. So say, for example, like a throat infection. So they've actually moved on to a test and treat model. And then they've moved that on again to independent prescribing, where the next step of that is actually, no, you need an antibiotic. I'm now going to prescribe you an antibiotic. So I think for me, they all seem like quite basic things, and they all seem like baby steps, but starting with something like that allows the evolution onto more and more expansion of the clinical services. So for me, it's to keep doing more of what we currently recognise that we want our pharmacists and need our pharmacists to do. And secondly, find a way to disrupt and push into that space where we know our patients see us. And I think the other thing, like every single community pharmacy or pharmacist in this room, they know that we see people way more than any other healthcare professional, and we don't just see the very ill. We see the well and the worried well, where actually a very early intervention could make a massive difference. And again, taking it to a different level, you have the pilot going on in England now around cancer referral for cancer screening, so identifying those red flags. And it's in 4 key areas, I think Greater Manchester, Kent, Cornwall, and the other one escapes me. But even where now we're upskilling and using that skill set from pharmacists to identify cancers at stage 1 and 2, as opposed to 3 and 4, when actually the patient outcomes and the cost of treatment is much, much higher.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I see lots of exciting stuff going on around the world, and we're doing exciting stuff here. Like, you know, the rollout of the PrEP medicines as well is probably quite niche here in Ireland, but that was a really, really good intervention. Because I think probably what we need to move away from in a healthcare system is to say, you know, there's a great book out there and it's called The Patient Will See You Now, rather than the doctor will see you now. And what we need to be able to say is why were we able to get a 95% vaccination rating for COVID? Well, the reason is we gave people choice and we gave people access. Just because you set up a vaccination centre, if I'm hesitant about a vaccine and I have to travel up to the RTC in Waterford from Dungarvan, ask my son or daughter to take a day off work because you don't know how to get there, and then you don't know the person who's going to administer it to you, that's probably 3 or 4 reasons why you won't get it. The conversation that I can have with you when you come to me about seasonal rhinitis, and I'll give myself a plug for Movember, I'll recognise you as a man who probably needs to have a conversation with somebody around men's health. So I can have that much more easily with you than you getting a text message from the HSE to present yourself at a vaccination centre 30 miles from there at a time of their choosing. So again, to back up what Ciara is saying, if we can give people choice and we can give people access to an appropriate level of intervention, we can do an awful lot more for them, for a better outcome for the patient, but also for a better outcome for the whole healthcare system. And then it shores up what it is that we want to do as community pharmacists. We want to offer as much service as we can through our expertise to those people.
Okay, I want to move it on slightly, unless somebody has a comment or a question from the audience, another one. Okay, I'll stick with you, Daragh, on this, because I think you're interested in the idea of e-prescribing or health mail. How well can that work?
I'll go back to Movember now, Matt, because I'm plugging Movember. You can send me as much money as you like using your telephone, and it takes about 20 seconds. Now, if you, God forbid, were knocked down in the morning or whatever, and you end up in an ambulance, nobody has a clue anything about you. So a lot of the time now, I'm finding it more and more, and it's great. I will get a telephone call from a hospital pharmacist asking me to send on the details of somebody's medicines who has presented at hospital. Now, very simply, I got into a taxi there, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, and I started chatting away. The fellow, where are you going? I'm going to a pharmacy conference, la la la. He says, oh yeah, he was Lithuanian, and he went home and he visited the dentist in Lithuania because he hadn't been to a dentist in years. The dentist says, yeah, you need some antibiotics. I'll prescribe antibiotics for you. And he goes, great, and left the dentist's, and he was halfway home, and he realised he never got any prescription. So we went back to the dentist, and he says, where's the prescription? And the guy goes, the prescription is wherever you want it to be. So in Lithuania, you use your public service number, you walk into the pharmacy and say, I want my medicine dispensed here. It is a pull system where the patient then identifies themselves, and the prescription ends up in the pharmacy with the patient's medication record. Now that's happening in Lithuania, and it's been there for 10 years, it's there in Portugal. We have something that's nearly like that, but it really is just an advanced fax system, which is called Health Mail. And it's been an absolute godsend, and it got us through COVID, truth be told. But really what we need to do is we need to ramp that up to be able to say that we actually have true electronic prescribing. So if I go back to my comment about one of the core functions of a pharmacist is to be able to review somebody's medicines, just like that hospital pharmacist is trying to do. The better the data you have is a better outcome. And think of all of those conversations that are happening between hospital pharmacists and community pharmacists. Or one of the first things that happens when you go and you see a new consultant, or you, right, tell me all about yourself. And you spend 2/3 of your first introduction to a new consultant is them taking the notes that already exist in a paper file somewhere else. It's one of the most inefficient systems that you could
But you don't want to
possibly
make
imagine.
those doctors work for the time and the money that you're spending them.
But you have to say to yourself, can they work better and more efficiently if they have access to the notes? And the answer is, of course they can. But they're your notes. It's your medical history. So the person then has more choice and more access to early interventions, better healthcare outcomes, if that exists. And it's not expensive to do because the technology exists. Regulatorily, we've seen it done in European Union countries, so it's not difficult.
But is the state committed to it? Because this brings us back even in the hospitals, where every doctor and nurse should be carrying an iPad and immediately gain access to the health records, and instead they're still working with paper charts in many cases. So is this state set up to do things like this? Do you have an answer to that?
No.
Does anyone in the room have an answer to that particular question? Okay, what do you think of the potential here?
Yeah, I think it all comes back to this collaboration piece. And I think when you go back to Sláintecare and you go back to Healthy Ireland and any other piece of research that has been commissioned, it talks about the complexity of medicine, the complexity of healthcare needs, and that actually the only way patient outcomes are truly beneficial is if everybody is involved in the ecosystem. And I think that sharing, that digital sharing of electronic records and of health records and patient identifiers and all of that, that sets us up for success to be able to treat the patient. It's slow, and I think we have to continue to agitate and advocate for that. E-prescribing, we understand, we've been talking about that for quite some time. I know there's a strategy, there's a working group we're talking about within the next 5 years. But actually,
so within the what? Next 5 years?
Within the next 5 years.
And that working group has existed for 12 years already.
Yeah. But my point is, you think about what had to happen during COVID. So yes, Health Mail is a very infantile electronic transfer of information. It's not a proper e-prescribing system. But that moved from never would that even be thought of to very quickly brought in overnight to be able to deal with what we needed to deal with in the pandemic. So we need to agitate to move the next phase of it on further.
So does that mean that we only get things done when it's an absolute crisis which forces administrators to act?
That would be the logical conclusion to come to from the evidence presented, yeah. Matt, I'll highlight it, right? I see Robin Hannay here. I met Robin there a couple of weeks ago, and we were just chatting about, pharmacists being so good at adopting technology. So I'm a third generation pharmacist. So one of the first telephones in Cavan was in my grandparents' pharmacy. So they didn't really know what they would use a telephone for, but it actually made it easier and more efficient for them to ring the wholesaler, rather than having to write everything down on a piece of paper, put it back in the box, and the stuff got there.
Yeah.
The next thing then that came along is the first time I saw a computer was in 1984 in my father's dispensary, and it was a BBC computer. So we have digitalized our records in community pharmacy for 40 years. So I would say the best place to start with unique health identifiers, which are existing, is actually with community pharmacy, because we have a digitalized database for every single patient that we have prescribed and dispensed medicines for. So start with us. The conversation starts with us.
Okay, let's move towards the end. Let's talk about future trends. And I hope I've got this word right.
Cogenomics.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
What's that?
So I suppose it's really thinking about where is the shift going to come in terms of pharmacist utilisation and optimisation of medicines. So I suppose pharmacogenomics is one that I'm particularly interested in because WBA or Walgreens have been piloting this in Norway since 19 and continued through actually COVID, and some of the patient outcomes are very good. But it's really, I suppose, challenging the old thought that medicine is a one-size-fits-all and one medicine will do the same thing to all people. Actually, what it's about understanding is how your genetic makeup actually then determines how you deal with the medicine. And what I mean by that is whether you have an adverse reaction, whether you need less of it to have an effect, or whether you need more of it to have an effect. And in that pilot in Norway, they are working in collaboration with the prescriber and the pharmacist, and the pharmacist is actually involved in that understanding of the genetic profile or the genomic profile to then talk about how you tailor the dose of medicine. And I think, from where we are now, that probably seems very far away, but it is just one example of actually where our eyes should be shifting towards the optimization of medicine. So I spoke about that 2 billion number. That is massive. But actually thinking about a healthcare system in the future where we're all much more cognizant of cost and value for money too, truly understanding how drugs work and how we metabolize drugs and get the best from them is incredibly important. And as I said, pharmacists are the experts in medicines. It's the space we can absolutely play in.
You say cost, value for money, but also efficacy,
Absolutely.
just so that they work better.
Yeah, and I think, look, we're all aware of it. We are in a population that is aging. It's growing rapidly. We are seeing more complex needs. We have about 50% of the population now who visit their GP for the maintenance of chronic conditions. We're going to need to think about a different way of working into the future. We know about a lot of the instances where just through the pandemic, because our GP colleagues were, at the point where they couldn't see any more patients, we have a lot of health conditions and underlying needs that just have not been identified and addressed over the last couple of years. And we're about to come into a tsunami of actually identifying a lot of conditions that have possibly sat under the radar for the past couple of years. So I believe, yes, it's going to be a very challenging couple of years in the health system, but I also believe actually this is where we agitate and we use the opportunity for each health professional to come into their own, and pharmacy is one which could come in a lot more to their own.
I'm going to finish with a question to you, Daragh, and I don't want a nod or a silence answer. What are we getting right in Ireland?
We're getting right the relationship between pharmacists and the people that they serve. And don't ask me, ask Ipsos, MRBI, or whoever it is conducted the poll, because we come out at 97% satisfaction rate. If you scratch a little bit under that surface, so much of why that figure is at 97% is stuff that we've talked about today. But it basically goes down to what my grandparents would have said, and this has never changed in business. If you look after the people will look after you. We have never looked after people better or done more for them than we have through COVID and what we are doing now. And I love being a community pharmacist. I love advocating that people should be able to get more from their community pharmacies. And I see that we are going to get there and we're doing a lot of things right. So I take great solace from health mail happening. That kind of hopefully is going to burst the seal on that. So that will become true electronic prescribing. I love we give more choice and access to people around their vaccinations, and there are conversations happening with the HSE to allow more vaccinations to happen through community pharmacies. I'm very proud of PrEP being out there to access a cohort in a community that always don't find it easy just to get into the healthcare system. And then a really, really big one is around women's health and access to contraception in a non-paternalistic way, which isn't, you'll show up at a time that I decide in 3 weeks and this is how much it's going to cost you. And in effect, you're the lucky one that you get to see me.
Daragh and Caoimhe, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.